Here's a thought experiment, and hopefully you don't mind bearing with me. Let's think about colour. This wall is blue, and people watching with normal trichromatic vision, or even red-green colour blindness, will probably experience it as blue. Different languages break up the colour spectrum in different ways, but most of us can probably agree that this hue is similar to the colour of the sky on a sunny day, and dissimilar to the colour of a normal wood fire at night, for example. Howler monkeys also have trichromatic vision similar to most humans, and even without their own words for colours, they can perceive that these two things are similar colours and that this is a quite different colour. An AI algorithm, properly trained, can do the same thing if you feed it photographs of these colours. When we see a colour, cells in our retinas are detecting different wavelengths of light. By combining information from different types of cone cell, we can detect objects in front of us and learn things about them. But we don't just take in the information and process it in a computery way. Think about the experience of seeing blue. Think about what blue looks like. This experience, this colour, isn't a real property of the object. It's not part of the real world. It's just a tool our brain uses to represent that frequency, that wavelength for us. In fact, if you think about it, the real world doesn't really look like anything. How it's seen depends on the thing that's seeing it. That's a line of thinking for another video. The main point is that the electromagnetic frequencies are real, but what blue looks like isn't real. It's just something your brain has made up. All of the things that you need colour for, whether that's telling whether fruit is rotten, or telling objects apart, or telling whether something is hot, could just be done by numeric calculations in the brain, which is, after all, just a very advanced computer. Why do we have this sensation of what blue looks like, when our brain could get along just as well with calculations without giving us this made-up visual sensation of what the wavelength looks like? You could think of it as something extra that's layered on top of all of the calculations our brain does to work out how we should behave and react to things. On some level, I think we realise that the colour percepts we see are kind of arbitrary. Most of us have pondered on the question, is my red the same as your red? That's because we realise that the exact experience of red we have doesn't matter as much as the fact that we can tell the difference between red and blue. If I switch the red and blue colour channels over in my editing software, you can still see all the same colour distinctions. It's just that different percepts are attached to different wavelengths of light. I could be wrong, but I'd imagine that most of us have no issue with the idea that a dog or a bird has colour percepts in the same way that we do. Of course, they see slightly different spectra of light, and maybe their colour percepts look a bit different. There's no way of telling. But we accept that their visual systems aren't just doing number calculations of has this fruit gone off, is my baby bleeding. They're actually seeing colours in much the same way we do. There are YouTube videos on what colours look like to a dog, which suggests that people take for granted that dogs do see colours, even if they see them a bit differently. Something analogous but more complicated is consciousness. It's hard to describe, but I'd describe it as the intense awareness that transcends just complex calculations and responding to stimuli. It's not just self-awareness, because a computer can acknowledge that it exists and that it's a computer. It's not just intelligence, because a computer can do very intelligent things. It's something that seems almost magic, this intense subjective awareness we have that we are here. At least that's what it is for me. I can't prove my consciousness is the same as yours, just as I can't prove my red is the same as your red. Again, it's clear that computers can apparently do a lot of cognitive things humans can do, without apparently having this subjective consciousness. It's just a matter of very complicated calculation. In fact, even in humans, there's good evidence that decision-making happens independently of consciousness. Our brains do the calculations and come to decisions before our conscious minds are even told that the decision has been made. All our behaviour could just be a result of numeric calculations, and yet we have this extra layer, this consciousness. It's a lot like colour perception. There's the calculations, and then our seemingly kind of needless experience of the calculations. So why is it that we're a lot happier saying, yeah, birds experience colour similarly to us, than we are saying birds experience consciousness similarly to us? This isn't cut and dry. Many people probably think birds are conscious like us, but many think that they're probably less conscious because they're less intelligent and less self-aware. Some people probably think that they're not conscious at all, and that their brains are just running the numbers to determine how they behave. In general, we're a lot less willing to extend consciousness to other animals than we are to extend human-like colour perception to them. I was talking to my girlfriend about this, who's a visual neuroscientist, and she suggested that it has to do with people's experience of consciousness, that it's difficult to imagine a kind of consciousness that's different to our own. She made an important point that I hadn't considered. Some, possibly most people, have verbal internal monologues. There's continuous speech inside their heads that narrates what they're doing and talks through decisions for them. This didn't occur to me because I, like many other people, don't personally have this, but I can imagine for someone with an internal monologue, it's hard to separate the monologue from consciousness in general. I'm not going to do a whole video about internal monologues because I think it's something that kind of circulates the internet every so often, and there's plenty of articles on it already. But the experimental research I've seen, the very, very small amount of experimental research I've seen on this suggests that it's more of a kind of multi-dimensional spectrum that changes from person to person and from time to time. So some people have almost constant inner speech where there's like a narrator inside their head narrating what they're thinking. Some people have none, but they think in images a lot. Some deaf people report kind of seeing disembodied hands, doing sign language in their mind, and other people think in kind of abstract thoughts. And I suppose I probably fall into that category because I don't think my thoughts are tied to any particular sensory modality. I don't have aphantasia or anything like that, so I can visualise things and I can simulate speech in my mind. But most of the time, really, I'm not, unless I deliberately visualise something or I deliberately imagine someone talking, there's really the only sensory experience I'm having is the sensory experience of what's around me. I'm not hearing a voice in my head, I'm not seeing anyone talking in my head. And to me, that's just how thought works. It's something that's kind of invisible, inaudible most of the time, and something that almost goes on in a black box in my head, where I often don't have access to it. So, it's not frustrating because for me that's just how it is. So, like, for example, I don't know what I'm going to say until it comes out of my mouth and I hear myself say it. And that's not as disconcerting as it sounds because I know that the speech is coming from my brain and I know it's not going to say anything I disagree with. So it feels fine. But, yeah, that's just by way of an explanation for somebody who kind of thinks differently to me. And I'm always curious about how it is to have an internal monologue as well, because it's like, I don't know, when someone's speaking to me while I'm trying to do something, I find it quite hard to focus on what I'm doing, so I can't imagine a kind of immutable. But then also, I do talk to myself when I'm walking around, so I suppose maybe that serves the function that the internal monologue serves in other people. But yeah, it seems to be a very broad spectrum, and that's just my own personal experience of it. But the point being that you don't have to have language to think consciously. You don't have to be able to see to think consciously. Obviously, blind people are conscious. Thought can happen. Conscious thought can happen independent of sensory modality. This is something I use to remind myself that although subjective experience and introspection is useful in looking for things to study, we shouldn't rely on it. We need to acknowledge that even things which are fundamental to our experience aren't fundamental to everyone's. For a long time, inner speech seemed to be treated as some kind of prerequisite to human conscious thought, presumably by researchers who had inner speech themselves. All I know is that I don't experience inner speech unless I deliberately try to. That doesn't necessarily mean that inner speech wasn't important in the past. It might be something that was instrumental in the cognitive evolution of humans, but has since diversified into a range of ways of thinking, just like Latin has diversified into the range of modern Romance languages. While it's hard to describe consciousness, we can maybe describe some of its limitations that it seems to have. In my subjective experience, and I've had this ratified by a lecturer at university who studies consciousness, although it might not be everybody's experience, we're only conscious of a very limited set of things at once. We may know a lot of things, we may know a load of people's birthdays and that the sky is blue and that wolves are dangerous, but we're not conscious of any of these things most of the time. For example, I can visualise things in my mind as most but not all people can, and I can see as most but not all people can. When I visualise something and focus on this imaginary image, I'm usually not conscious of what I'm actually seeing with my eyes in real life. I can flick between the two quickly, but for me it's either one or the other. I can't be paying attention to both at once. Now, cognitive processes are still going on. If I'm focusing on a daydream, my visual system is still processing real visual information, and if suddenly someone started sprinting towards me or a tiger jumped out of a bush, my brain would pull me out of the daydream and make me concentrate on the real world. But that processing happens in a bit of my brain I'm not conscious of while I'm focusing on the daydream. So we can already see that computations about the environment can happen outside of our consciousness. Something I noticed, which I'm happy to be corrected on, is that when I'm conscious of a sensory modality, like sight, a very large amount of high-level processing has already been done. It's very hard for me to look at a visual scene without knowing how far away things are, which things are separate objects and what those objects are, information about how the scene is lit, if there are any people I know in it. The information coming in through my retina is just colour and brightness, and the retina is sensitive to some very basic things like edges. Piecing the information together and recognising objects happens later on. Now, ordinarily, I can't look at a visual scene without my brain analysing it for me. I can't shift my consciousness to an earlier stage in the visual pathway where I haven't analysed that information yet. Maybe you could do this kind of thing through meditation, I don't know. But it seems like my consciousness wants to exist in a part of the brain where a lot of information has already been processed. The brain has pathways, and a given bit of information gets processed in a particular order. Visual information may be analysed, sent to the executive function areas of the brain to decide what to do, and then that decision gets sent to the motor part of the brain that organises it into behaviour, and that gets sent down motor neurons which make the muscles contract. If our consciousness can be said to exist in a particular part of the brain, maybe that's a part of the brain that's fairly high level in one of these pathways, so that the information we get has already been processed by the time we're conscious of it. Some researchers have suggested that consciousness may have something to do with the fact that humans don't have a load of built-in instinctive behaviour like a lot of animals do. We have to organise a lot of our behaviour deliberately. We can get it to the point that it's pretty much automatic, but first we have to think about and develop the behaviour. Maybe consciousness is related to the system that organises that new, non-automatic behaviour. Researchers like Brian Earle have looked at the possibility that consciousness is somehow for enacting behaviour and decision-making. In my opinion, this makes intuitive sense. The decision-making and behaviour organising part of the brain has access to fully processed information like our consciousness seems to. And I and a lot of other people I've talked to experience decision-making as something that they either do consciously or something that's very close to consciousness. Earle presents the idea of a hypothetical system in the brain called the FRM, the Flexible Response Mechanism. The FRM is a cognitive machine for taking in information about the task you're meant to be doing and manipulating the information to work out how you should respond. So the FRM has input data, a combination of all kinds of sensory information that's already been analysed and processed, and it works on that input data. It manipulates the input data and turns it into output, which is presumably behaviour or something close to behaviour. Earle's suggestion is that consciousness is not the FRM, but the input to the FRM. That consciousness is pure information and not a mechanism that processes information. This is a very important part of Earle's argument that I find quite convincing. This is where we get into the realm of introspection, and I'm very aware that these points may not apply to everyone. But he argues that when we make a decision, we may be aware of stages in the decision-making process popping into our consciousness, but we aren't aware of the actual data manipulations that produce the decision. We aren't aware of the actual minute information processing that leads to the decision. Inside our brains, neurons are firing at different rates, and the firing rates of those neurons ultimately determine what decision we make. We don't feel this happening. We don't really know exactly how the brain is coming to its decisions. It's like a black box algorithm in computer science. You can train an algorithm to recognise the difference between pictures of cats and pictures of ducks by giving it a load of labelled pictures of both of them from all kinds of different angles and telling it to work out what the differences are. And you can then give it an unlabelled picture of a duck, and if it's been trained right, it will tell you that it's a duck. You know it's got the right answer, but you don't know exactly how the algorithm has made the decision. You don't know exactly what features it's recognised to make the duck diagnosis. At least for me, it's the same way with my brain. I effectively send it a request and get an answer out. I may be able to introspectively think about why it might have come to that decision, why it might have come to that conclusion, but I can't actually see the data manipulations that it's doing. Earl's article makes a point that I've noticed independently myself, and that I mentioned in the internal monologue thing. I don't know what words I'm going to say until I've already said them. For people within a speech, the brain may send your consciousness a simulation of what it's going to say, which you experience before you actually say the words, but again, you don't get to see the calculations that produce those words. The feeling we get of having made a decision, while it feels a lot like a conscious process of deciding, is actually just our brain telling our consciousness that the decision has been made. We don't even consciously decide what will enter our consciousness next. Our brain determines that for us. Earl suggests that the FRM, this decision-making machine, works best if it's only trying to handle a small amount of information at once, and that's why we only tend to pay conscious attention to one thing at once. If we pay attention to one thing at once, the FRM can dedicate all its resources to processing that one thing, and it can probably come to a quicker decision than it would if it was trying to process a load of irrelevant information. You might have noticed an issue. This theory narrows down the kind of thing that consciousness might be and where in our stream of neural information it might live, but so far it still doesn't explain why it produces this incredible awareness we have. It kind of gives you an idea of where consciousness might be, but it doesn't explain what it is or how it's produced. Why couldn't this input just not be conscious, just like the input to a calculator presumably isn't conscious? One interesting way Earl looks at the question is to ask, does consciousness itself have any kind of survival advantage? Is it something that's evolved specifically for some purpose, or is it an emergent property that just naturally pops up wherever you do really complex data input, but which has no survival value in and of itself? Earl thinks that the very complex organisation of consciousness suggests it has evolved and been subject to evolutionary pressures, and that it probably does increase our chances of surviving in the world. He actually uses a similar example to what I used at the start of the video, what he calls qualia, which is a common idea in neuroscience and philosophy, although I think it's differently defined in philosophy. Qualia are things that the brain uses to present information to us. We don't just experience a load of numbers telling us wavelengths and frequencies, we see colour, we hear pitch, things which feel so much more intense and distinctive than just the numeric data that our sensory organs give us. He says that consciousness is qualia. It's the combination of all these intense representations that our brain gives us, not just colour and sound, but texture, what our thoughts feel like, heat and cold, and pain, and things like that. Lots of bits of our brain do complex data analysis, but most of these bits of our brain don't seem to be conscious and don't seem to produce qualia. Earl seems very forthcoming about the fact that this is mostly based on introspection of how consciousness feels like it works. I get the impression that the article is more just a better defining of where we might want to look for empirical evidence of consciousness, rather than some complete explanation of it. Because it's based on introspection by humans, it's hard to tell whether other animals would have these qualia and have consciousness. If this explanation of consciousness were true, it might guide our thinking a little bit. It might imply that things more closely genetically related to humans are more likely to have qualia and consciousness and subjective experience. Because birds have very different brain organisation to mammals, maybe they've solved the problem in a different way. Or maybe they've convergently evolved a similar system of consciousness, or maybe consciousness is a much older trait and animals with more automatic behaviours just use the cognitive tool of consciousness for something else. Although I think the way Earl describes it makes it seem pretty specialised to non-automatic behaviours. Thinking about qualia is a bit freaky. Earlier I said that the world doesn't really look like anything and that our brains make it look like something, perhaps so that we can understand it better. At that point in the research process for this video, I was mainly thinking about colour, but surely it applies to other kinds of qualia as well. How we perceive things like sound and even things like distance and shape are qualia themselves, but the brains of other animals and even other people might deploy these qualia in extremely different ways. As long as they're internally consistent in the animal's brain, it works just as well. I was first introduced to this idea by Richard Dawkins' book The Ancestor's Tale, where he refers to a famous article on what it's like to be a bat, which is a little exploration of animal consciousness. In a kind of extension of the thought experiment, Dawkins suggested that because bats rely on hearing as their primary sense rather than sight, maybe they've taken the qualia that humans use for colour and applied them to some other natural property like texture. So maybe a bat experiences a rough texture in the same way that I experience red. Thinking about this leads the mind down a little rabbit hole about qualia in general. Is there something about visual qualia like distance and colour that sort of ties them together as opposed to auditory qualia like loudness and pitch? I don't really know. I can't tell. I've never experienced anything any other way than I do at the moment. Anyway, for Dawkins's suggestion, well, I don't think he's suggesting it as a serious empirical fact, but his thought experiment to hold water, we'd be assuming that the properties of different qualia are kind of conserved or similar from generation to generation. What colours feel like to me is roughly the same as what they feel like to you. And of course we can't prove this is true or false at the moment. Before I go any further with the qualia thing, I think it's important to say that there is, within academia, a serious argument that qualia are not real or not scientifically important. This argument comes from several angles, and I won't be able to do them all justice here. To make my biases clear, I also don't find this argument very intuitive or satisfactory, which is likely to be a failure of my understanding rather than a failure of the argument. So I'm sorry if I don't explain it very well, and I'm sure somebody in the comments will explain it better than I can. But as I understand it, our subjective experiences are impossible to make reasoned scientific arguments about because only we have access to them, and if we want to convey them, we have to do so using language of some kind, even if that's mathematical language, which is clearly not good enough for describing every single aspect of our experience. This is clear from the fact that I can't describe what my red looks like in a way that would make sense to someone who's never seen it before. We also can't even be sure of any aspect of our experience that's not current. Daniel Dennett points out that if somebody suddenly changed our qualia, for example by flipping the red and green colour channels over like I did earlier in this video, we wouldn't be able to know if someone had really changed our qualia or just changed our memories of what our qualia used to look like. For all we know, our colour qualia could change every time we blink and our brains could just gloss over it. To me, this seems not like a positive argument that qualia don't exist, but an argument that we shouldn't bother trying to learn about them, and it's completely futile for us to do so. The interviewer Louis Goldbout once put it to Daniel Dennett, when you see a blue door, that information from the blue door hits your retina, it gets converted into spike trains in your neurons, sequences of electrical pulses. But the phenomenal experience of seeing the door is different from a load of spike trains. Dennett responded, I'm paraphrasing but I'll put the actual quote on screen, that in the end there'll be a scientific story of you and your brain, but your conscious subjective self will not be a character in that story. The first person story of you is extractable from all of that scientific data about your brain, but that's it, that's all it is. To clarify what I think he means, and I apologise if I misrepresent it, if you had absolutely every bit of possible information about someone's physical brain, you would be able to say everything it is scientifically possible to say about that person and their experience, and there is nothing else to it. The qualia we experience are an illusion and do not exist in any scientific sense. They're not real and not worthy of scientific consideration. I find this point of view genuinely staggering, but not in a disparaging way. It's another thing that goes to show that two humans can think about logic in two very different ways. To me, qualia are the only things I know are real because they're the only things I actually directly experience. It might be true that they're not scientifically measurable, and you could make a point that there's no point studying them scientifically, but to deny their reality surprises me quite a lot. Having said that, I'm not a philosopher, and I know philosophy is one of these fields where people outside of it pretend to have a better understanding of it than they actually do, and I don't want to be one of those people, so I'll stick to neuroscience arguments here, while acknowledging that my video is going to be slightly incomplete because of that. Is this stag beetle conscious? I asked that question specifically because I happen to have some nice footage of a stag beetle, but the question of whether other things than humans are conscious is an interesting one for those of us who want to understand consciousness better. Different people will have different intuitions. If you come from a religious background that states humans are uniquely created by a god, it may seem more intuitive that consciousness is a human thing and that other animals don't have it. From my own kind of empiricist angle, it would almost surprise me if humans were the only things that were conscious, because human exceptionalism isn't very popular in academia at the moment. But of course, academic paradigms sort of come and go, so that could just be a modern artefact. Does it make sense to talk of animals that are still conscious, but less conscious than humans? If consciousness arises from qualia, which will represent the real world outside, then it follows that perceiving the outside world may be some kind of prerequisite to human-like consciousness. This is quite a low bar. Even bacteria can react to the outside world in pretty sophisticated ways, considering they don't have brains or nervous systems. In fact, basically anything physical can react to the world around it. If you drop rock A onto rock B and rock B breaks in half, you could argue that even that is a reaction, a response to an event, a way of recording very, very basic information about something that's happened. Could a rock be conscious just in a way that's very, very broken down and simple? Could a rock have some kind of quale that corresponds to being hot versus being cold, being broken versus not being broken? Could a rock, in other words, have a subjective experience like a human has? If we accept that we don't really know what consciousness is yet, I'd argue that we have to accept, yes, that is possible. Maybe it's some property of the universe that gets locally amplified by brain activity. This is a very old way of thinking about consciousness called Panpsychism, the idea that pretty much everything is conscious. This reflects the animistic beliefs of a lot of non-Western societies, the idea that the world is populated by people and that only some of those people are human. Panpsychism might feel like some kind of woo-woo ghost nonsense, but clearly conventional neuroscience doesn't seem to be enough to explain consciousness at the moment, and a lot of scientific discoveries come from outside-the-box thinking. Some people think consciousness is generated at the quantum level within neurons. I know next to nothing about quantum physics, so I'm not the person to assess this, but I think there's some risk of looking at quantum physics as this domain that isn't completely understood and thinking consciousness is mysterious, it must live there in the world of quantum physics. Most of this video has been fairly introspection based, and it's been kind of just a sort of wandering of thoughts rather than anything particularly scientific. So I'll end on something else introspection based, which is just a kind of observation about my own consciousness, and maybe a request to anyone else who has the same experience to maybe put it in the comments. But I feel as if my own consciousness has become less intense as I've got older. I feel, in a very real way, I feel less conscious than I was when I was 6 or 7 or 8. Or even 12 or 13. And I think, and this is just, kind of intuition in hindsight, it's not, I don't know this, but I think part of it might be that my senses have dulled as I've got older. So my senses of taste and smell have become much worse since I was a teenager. There are certain things I can't smell at all anymore, and in general my senses of taste and smell have got worse. My sense of hearing has also got worse since I was a teenager. And I wonder if the direct relationship between sense and consciousness is, I don't know, if that's a data point that maybe contributes to the idea that there's a relationship between those two things. I put this to a couple of friends, and both of them said that they felt a kind of a similar thing, but they thought it had more to do with the fact that they've not had as many novel experiences as adults than they did when they were children and teenagers. When you're a child, obviously everything is new. When you're a teenager, you still experience a lot of new things. But as an adult, even a young adult, you maybe don't necessarily experience many new things unless you seek them out. And even so, a lot of the new things you do experience can be conceptualized in terms of old things that you've already experienced. Aspects of the experience of snowboarding are similar to aspects of the experience of skateboarding, for example. But if you've never ridden a bike before, then that's a very new experience. I also feel like, because I'm a bit less mobile than I was as a child, I don't do things like crouch down and look at the ground, or kind of lie in the grass and see the grass right, next to my eyes, and feel the grass against my face as much as I used to when I was a child. And maybe that factors into it as well. I'm just not stimulating certain senses as much as I was back then. But yeah, I spent a long time thinking, has your consciousness really dulled, or do you just think it has? And I think at the moment my thinking on this is that my consciousness is completely subjective, and I am, my feelings and my testimony on my consciousness are the best evidence of it that we have. So I feel that I have become less conscious, not unconscious, but less conscious. And it led me to wonder about the idea of a kind of philosophical zombie, which is something that's been hanging around philosophy for a very long time, which is a person which is computationally distinguishable from a normal human, but doesn't have a subjective consciousness somehow. We don't know if this is scientifically possible, because again, we don't know what consciousness is. Maybe a human brain just inherently produces consciousness, and you couldn't have a human without consciousness. But yeah, I certainly I realise that might have sounded like I was saying the older you get, the more of a philosophical zombie you get, and I don't think that's true at all. But yeah, I don't really know where I was going. I suppose I just made that connection in my head. Yeah, I think that might have been more or less the end of what I wanted to talk about. So if anyone has any other thoughts on this, and I'm sure different people have different thoughts that vary very widely, feel free to comment in the description. I'm going to leave that in, because I think I don't know, it's okay to not be very good at speaking sometimes, and I think I'm just going to leave that in. Yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.